I want to give today just sort of an intro to generalized linear models. It'll be sort of mildly technical. The idea is kind of to try to give an intuition for what's going on with the models. You may have used the GLM function in R or some other linear model in the past, regression models and so on. And I'm going to switch to writing because it's going to be sort of like a chalk talk. So I'm going to just switch my screen. Can everyone see that? Great. Okay. So the reference for linear models, generalized linear models, is the original reference is McCullough and Nedler, and this is in the 80s, 85 and 89. And at the time, people were sort of ad hoc building linear models, generalized linear models, and they sort of systematized the language. And there's many other sources. Another source that I like for categorical data analysis is this book by Eberly. And I find that they do apply a lot to genetic data and biological data. That's most of the examples. We have a lot of clinical studies as well as genetics and things like that. But I'm going to be focused more on the abstract situation. So the big picture is you can think of your experiment generates some outcomes, right? And each outcome is kind of a row of data, right? And the row of data has some characteristics like, I don't know, maybe it has color, it's like red or blue. Maybe it has weight, that's a you know, a floating point number, and maybe it has some something that you care about, like is it disease state, you know, yes or no, right? And you can imagine there's many different rows like this, and you can think about each row is one outcome or one experiment, one individual, and then you summarize that table into some smaller table. Might be multidimensional, and each dimension represents, so now color is this dimension and weight is this dimension, except that now weight is not, weight is continuous, and the disease state is maybe this dimension, and you maybe throw away some dimensions and you end up with in each cell some kind of count. And that's really the thing that we focus on for generalized linear models. In the simplest example, it's just like a 2x2 table, and you might be interested in measuring using a chi-squared test to measure association. You know, are these things independent or are they not? And I'd say for GLM, the other thing you want to keep in mind is that rather than model the whole table, and there's sort of an asterisk here, but we're looking at a conditional. So in other words, you know, there's some response variable that we're most interested in, y, and then we have explanatory variables, x1, x2, x3, and we don't necessarily care about the overall presence of y. So there's often kind of one degree of freedom that we throw away when we're thinking about this. Now, the exception to that is that, well, if I just make my response variable literally the count or the expected count of a table entry, then I can model the entire table. So that's really not too restrictive. And this is the same setting as regression, right? So in regression or standard, you know, linear model, we have some y, we have some x, and we get a cloud of observations, and we try to fit a line, right? Some sort of it's not a very good fit to that line, but okay. So we try to fit a line, and there are a bunch of assumptions that go into regression. If you take a regression class, a lot of the work is on checking whether the assumptions are satisfied, like is there heteroscedasticity? Is there, meaning does the variance change as the value of the input or the output changes? Is there, is the error normal? You know, do we have a situation where is a linear relationship preserved, or would a curve be a better fit, and so on? And so one of the major generalizations that's happening in generalized linear model is that whereas in regression, everything is always normal, we're assuming a Gaussian distribution. In GLM, we're allowed to let's say noise is normal. Noise comes from an exponential family. So it comes from a much broader class of probability distributions, which includes the normal distribution, but can also include other distributions. And you can think about one reason we're doing that is because we need to now deal with discrete distributions, like the number of times that something happens. You know, there's a famous example where you're counting skiers coming down a hill and you're asking whether or not they have a cold or not, whether they've had vitamin C that day or not. And the number of people that show up with a cold is a positive discrete number. Or you're looking at variants appearing in the gene, and these things are just positive numbers, and they can't be arbitrary negative or continuous results. So we need probability distributions that can handle that. And similarly, so maybe it looks like this, or it looks like that, or it has some other distribution that's not normal. And an important part of modeling with GLMs is that we want to make sure that the noise distribution that we're assuming explicitly or implicitly in our model matches closely to the data. Otherwise, if the noise doesn't match, the problem is your inference. Some things will still work, like maybe your measure of central tendency will work, your some sort of measure of the mean might be sort of okay, but all your inference is bad. So your decisions about what is significant and what is not won't work. You'll miss things that are significant, or you'll ascribe significance to relationships that aren't really there. So it's important to get those noise models right, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so I should say that even within straight linear models, that is regression models, one thing we're allowed to do is transformations. So when everything is continuous, if I have a situation where the response of y is exponential to x, I can take log of x instead, right? Or log of y. Or I can take a square root, or I can do whatever, so I can transform both the input and the output variables, the predictor and the explanatory variables, using some kind of transformation, and those things are still allowed in the context of generalized linear models. So whether you're in linear or nonlinear or generalized linear models, you have really a lot of modeling power, a lot of choices that you can make. So again, the main sort of motivation for GLMs is the additional flexibility allowed by letting your variables, both your response and your explanatory variables, be discrete. And you can distinguish between a couple of different types of discrete variables. There's what's called nominal ones, like my example of color, red, blue, green, right? Or yes, no, binary. It's very important. But then there's also sometimes ordinal, like you have categories, your data has categories, but it's like low, medium, high, right? High is bigger than low. And you can think about nominal generally gets encoded. Each variable gets kind of its own dimension. Ordinal might get encoded like low is 0, medium is 1, high is 2, something like that. And then there's also interval data, blood pressure or something. 0, I guess, is bad, but or some measure you have, right? Something like that. And then these are obviously related. And the ordinal and interval are, and then sort of on top of that is continuous, where you actually have a real number that corresponds to the value that you're measuring. Okay, so now to turn this into, or to find a generalized linear model, we want to somehow plug this thing into the linear framework, right? We'll plug these discrete variables into linear framework. we want to figure out an appropriate noise model. You know, should we be using gamma? Should we be using Poisson? And typically there's like a location and a spread, and we want to be able to fit and diagnose. And for fit, we're generally going to rely on our software to do it. And just to comment around fit and diagnostics, typically we're going to be using the maximum likelihood framework. And regression, you can think of as a special situation where the likelihood corresponds to the Euclidean distance, the squared distance, the squared norms. But in general, the likelihood for the models that you construct in the GLM will be some other function that we have to optimize using software. And you want to interpret the coefficients, interpret the results you get, which generally can be interpreted in terms of sort of stacked odds ratios and kind of changes in odds ratios. And just to put in for a moment into the broader context, GLMs, I think of them as being, you know, they obviously do have some flexibility, but they're not nearly as flexible as something like neural networks. They're kind of naturally regularized, although there's also ways to add further regularization to them. Natural regularization. But because you're using a linear model, there sort of aren't that many parameters, and you're forcing it into being something linear, and so that reduces your chance of overfitting a little bit. And you can also add sparsity regularization, like an L1 regularization or L2 easily. And they're sort of easy to interpret up to sort of collinearity issues. And you can think about them as kind of like in the context of neural networks, which everyone loves to solve problems now, as sort of a one layer. This is like a one layer neural network. But they're, you know, I think of them as being a good baseline, right? So if there's a signal that you can get from a GLM, you can feel more confident that it's sort of really there. Although they can't deal with incredibly complicated relationships. Okay. Let me stop for a moment, see if there's any questions.
Thanks very much, Jason. I don't think any have appeared yet, so I will just encourage the audience to post in the Q&A, but thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to write a little bit more symbolic stuff. So, okay, so linear regression is saying that we have a response variable y, which is, we can think of as a random variable right now, is equal to an intercept plus some coefficients, beta 1, times some other random variables, explanatory random variables. Let's just put 2. I'm going to use 2 for a lot of this talk, just for simplicity, and plus some noise, right? So in linear regression, this is sort of our intercept. These are explanatory variables, which are, we can think of as random variables, continuous. This is continuous. And then we have some noise, and the noise is normal 0 sigma squared. Okay. And you can also sort of think of this as being, well, I'm taking some intercept, and then I'm taking an inner product of a vector of coefficients with a vector of random variables, and then I'm adding noise to it. And this idea of taking an inner product is key to the idea of an exponential family, which is the family of noise models that allow for a generalized linear model. And you can make that even simpler if you force your X vector to have a 1 in it, right? So if beta is like beta 0, beta 1, beta 2, and X is like 1, x1, x2, and you're just taking the dot product of these two. So you're multiplying all these entries and then summing them up. And then we have some noise. Okay. And this thing has an expected mean, what we expect the y value to be. That is expectation. My bold E there is just means expectation of the y value. And now I'm going to write lowercase values for x to mean the actual realizations of the variables rather than the random variables. So the expectation of the random variable y, given these two outcomes, is equal to beta 0 plus beta 1 little x1 plus beta 2 little x2. And this sentence has less information than the sentence above it. Like this one has less information. This one, because the one on top has the noise model. It has the epsilon. And the one on the bottom here, which is the mean, doesn't have say anything about the noise. It's just telling you what is the conditional expected mean. In other words, we're saying that when we add back in the noise model, we're saying that y is normal with mean this expectation of y, whatever that is, and variance sigma squared. Okay, so epsilon is, so this is because we're assuming epsilon to be normal with variance sigma squared. So we're explaining some variables in terms of some others. We have some parameters here, beta is not beta 1, beta 2, and we're making a judgment about the conditional distribution, and we have an assumption about the shape of the errors. And then again, in regression, a lot of the work is focused on whether this assumption that the error is normal is correct, and whether the linear relationship is correct. You know, we're looking for skew or bimodality or heteroscedasticity, etc. And in linear regression, we estimate the parameters with the least squares method. We're looking for the ones that minimize the sum of the squared error. You could also use a gradient ascent method, gradient descent method. Like you could just use neural network software, define the function the same way. I'll give you the same answer, just be a little slower. And you can think about that. What's happening here, you know, always with a generalization, if you think of the thing that you're trying to generalize is like a shadow of some larger object. And here, the larger object is the likelihood function. And the shadow in regression is that the likelihood function works out to be works out so that minimizing, or so rather maximizing the likelihood, making the data most likely given the parameters, equals, you know, minimizing this least squares measure of error. And there's nothing sort of special about least squares, except that it happens to work out that it minimizes likelihood for a normal distribution. And then we have measures of model fit, like R squared, F statistic, residuals, residual plots, and we'll need to, of course I won't be able to get to all of this today, but we'll need to generalize these measures of fit or correctness to the generalized linear model setting. Of course, that's a whole sort of class, but I just want to give it a teaser today. Okay, so then, and then we need also measures, methods for model selection. Meaning, you know, the simplest version of model selection is just what variables do I include? But that can get more sophisticated because we also think about interactions. You can think about the way in which the variables depend on each other. And so the first order thing is just what variables do we include, and that's often all you need. But then you can also add more to it. And there's different methods for that, like forward and backward selection, where you just slowly add in variables, add in the most significant next variable, or you subtract the least significant, or you can use regularized method, like like Lars or Lasso to select variables and then rerun it. And of course, we're going to still allow for transformation as well. If we have continuous variables, we might need to do some transformation on them. And we also allow for interaction terms like beta 1, x1, beta 2, x2, beta 3, x1, x2, for example. So, when we say linear, that restriction is not even that tight because we're also allowing for, really, this is a polynomial function of the input variables. Okay, so then the GLM allows y to be categorical, can be discrete, or categorical. In other words, has categories, and we allow x to be the same, to also be discrete and categorical. And we have to change all of our procedures for that. So let me just make a comment as to like, okay, so why can't we just use Gaussian noise? In the limit. And part of why, or a good way to think about why is, okay, so think about the simplest possible example, which is, okay, we have a success or fail. We have a binary outcome. Fail, binary outcome. With probability P. Okay, of win, of 1, and probability 1 minus P of fail, of 0. Right. And then the expectation of this random variable y is just P. Okay, so we can think about, oh, well, what we want to do is create a linear function that predicts this P, right? But there are a couple of problems with that. One is that a linear function that predicts this P, the value can go below 0 or above 1, and so thereby output nonsense. And the other, so we're going to have to do some transformation in order for it to make sense. And the other thing is that the variance of this y, which is the expectation of y squared minus the expectation of y squared, is P times 1 squared plus 1 minus P 0 squared minus P squared, P times 1 minus P. Okay, so typically in this Bernoulli distribution or in any exponential family, what's happening here is the variance varies or depends on the expectation. Right, so there's an interaction between the parameters. The normal is special in that we have a mean parameter and we have a spread parameter, and they're totally independent. But for these guys, there's always going to be not always, but there's often a relationship between variance and mean, a one-to-one relationship. And if the data doesn't fit it, then we have to introduce additional parameters. If our data is over dispersed or under dispersed, we have to do something else. I'm just going to say these words so that if you run into that issue, you know what to look up. Okay, so an example that I was used for binary outcomes, you can think about, okay, you're throwing darts at a board, you have some probability of hitting that the outcome will fit a Bernoulli or then a binomial distribution, like the total, if you do 10 throws or 100 throws. But if your skill level varies, like you do 1,000 throws and at the beginning you're not very good and at the end you're good, then the variance will be higher than it would be if you had a fixed probability of hitting the board. So when there's some underlying variation in the model or in the probability, that will cause over dispersion, and you have to deal with that in the model. Okay, so in this case, the normal distribution makes no sense. A linear function of P makes no sense, and so we have to do something else. And this, of course, will also affect our loss function, our likelihood function, and it will affect our fitting method. It's no longer tied to a quadratic loss. Okay, so then for GLM, instead of literally looking at the mean, literally predicting the expectation or the mean, we instead recognize that the mean is just an important parameter, and we just we model an arbitrary, well, not arbitrary, but we model an important parameter, typically a parameter that has to do with centrality, like where is the, what is the intensity? Parameter, usually a measure of central tendency or a measure of intensity or something. Like how often does something arrive in the Poisson case and of the desired discrete distribution. And we model that in a linear way, or actually we model a function of that in a linear way. And for this to work well, we use a specific class of noise distributions, not arbitrary noise distributions. And these are the exponential families. Of which the normal distribution is an example. And they have a nice functional form. So if you think about a probability distribution always defined by an f, and so I have x, f of x, this is what the normal distribution looks like, the intensity, how likely is it at its mean? We have a functional form for f that depends on the value that we're interested in. Y, maybe we should call this y, because we're looking at the outcome. And the parameters. That's a vector of parameters, and that's the outcome. So we're looking at a probability distribution function. And that function has three components. It has a part that depends only on the parameters. So you can think about that as like a normalization constant or a partition function that sums over all possible outcomes and depends only on the input parameters. It has a part that depends only on the value. And it has a part that depends on both. Oftentimes you don't need the part that depends on the value. And the part that depends on both, just like for the normal distribution, is an inner product. It's an inner product of some function of the parameters called the natural parameters and some function of the data, which is called the sufficient statistic. Okay, so in regression, this is just, I took literally the outcomes, the x's, and I took the dot product with the betas. So the eta of theta here is like the beta, and this is like the x in regression. And that shows up in the exponent in the normal distribution in regression, and that's why things work out the way they do there. Okay, so and let me just label these things a little bit more. So this is you'll hear this term sufficient statistic a lot in generalized linear models and discrete models. This is the function through which the data factors. The data only influences the probability or the likelihood after you take this function. So you think about it like a summary table. You have a huge amount of data, you crunch it down into a summary table, and that's what goes into your probability estimation or your statistics, and that's a sufficient statistic. And this is the natural parameters. And there's a lot of distributions that have this form: normal distribution, exponential, gamma, chi-squared, beta, Dirichlet, Poisson, Bernoulli, multinomial, binomial, lots of stuff. So there's some flexibility there, and most of those are built into a function, a program like R for doing estimation. Okay, so the GLM now, let's sort of bring together the components of the GLM. GLM, generalized linear model. So there's the random component that we were just talking about. That's the noise model. And this is drawn from an exponential family. Something that has that form that I just wrote, exponential family. possibly modified for over or under dispersion. And let me just give an example of over and under dispersion. So one of the most important exponential families that is good for thinking about biological problems is the Poisson. So the Poisson is, there's something that happens with a fixed hazard rate, or a hazard rate that depends on the other variables. So something like, how often does the bus arrive? Or how often does a car go by your window? Or how often does a mutation happen? And then that rate, if that rate is constant, given the things that the predictor variables, then it's Poisson. If that rate has sort of periods where it goes higher and then periods where it goes lower, then it might be an over dispersed Poisson. And so if you think about there's sort of autocorrelation in the rates, like there's more cars at rush hour and fewer cars not at rush hour, that will lead to over dispersion. And if there's some kind of inhibiting factor, like right after a car happens or right after a mutation happens, there won't be another one for a while, then that would lead to under dispersion. The variance is lower than you'd expect. The result is smoother than you would expect. Okay, so then I'm gonna just write that Poisson. And then there's a systematic component. Which is just that linear predictor. Whatever the variable that you're predicting, if there's only one parameter for the distribution, that's probably what you're predicting. But if there's more, you might have something else. So this is a linear function of the predictor variables. And in ordinary regression, this is just the mean, right? So that this is your expression for the mean. And in GLM, it's still linear function, but it predicts some function of a parameter. So for example, in the case before, we might have to do like a logit transformation. So it typically predicts transformation of the variable we care about. And one reason for that transformation is just to make it so that any continuous value that we might get out makes sense, right? So that values above 1 and below 0, for example, make sense. And then it gets transformed back into something useful. So this is beta 0 plus beta 1, x1 plus beta 2, x2. And then the third part of the linear model is the link function. So that's that function, that transformation. Connects the random and systematic components. And this is something that this is in some sense equivalent to transforming or related to transforming Y. So you might be messing with the link function in order to get a linear relationship. You might be messing with it in order to fix the issue of not being a number between 0 and 1, and you need a number between 0 and 1, something like that. Right, and then there's assumptions that have to go into for the GLM to be correct, and the assumptions are analogs of the assumptions that would go into regression. So we need the rows that flow in, the data rows, to be independent and identically distributed in the. So I say independent. Usually you'd say IID, independently distributed, but what exactly do you mean by independently distributed? Because when we vary the mean, the variance varies. So they're not. It's sort of weird to say they're independently. It's identically distributed. So identically up to the weirdness around exponential families. The dependent variable truly is an exponential family. And it's the right one. And we have a linear relationship between transformed variables and response after link, after hitting it with the link function. And we can add in, then we can add in transformations and interactions and all that. And again, the variance is not homogeneous, but still constrained. So rather than assuming, as we would in linear regression, that the residuals look like this, the variance is fixed over time. I mean, over various values of x. We assume that it's still constrained, but it's constrained to fit the functional form given by the exponential family. And the error is not normal. Okay, so we're getting to the end here. Let me do an example of logistic regression, just so we can see how the parts fit together. So logistic regression from the point of a GLM. So the link function is logit. The exponential family is a binomial distribution. So we take the probability of success and we transform it as log p over 1 minus p. We write that as beta 0. And there's other ways to derive logistic regression, but we just want to think about it as a GLM. And then we have the inputs. So success or not, disease state or not disease state, and then all of the possible predictor values. And so what we're doing here is we're not modeling the mean. We're not modeling the probability. We're not even modeling the odds ratio. What we're modeling is the log odds ratio. And that's a very common choice for ratio for GLMs. So for even much more complex GLMs, oftentimes what we're doing is modeling the log odds ratio, and then the parameters that go into it end up being odds ratios or multipliers of the odds ratio. So here, our random component for logistic regression is the binomial distribution, number of successes. We have n tries. We count how many successes we have. The systematic component is this linear function. And the link function is the logit. And then when you're applying a GLM using the GLM function in R, you have control over all of these things. You tell it which variables to put in, and then it estimates the parameters. You tell it which family to use, and that's the random component, and you specify which link function to use. Although sometimes there's only a few choices. Okay, so let me pause again to see if any questions have come up.
Thanks, Jason. I don't see any posted, so.
Okay. Let me... All right, well, so let's say something about, then in the remaining few minutes about something I threw out in the beginning, which is modeling kind of arbitrary tables of outcomes. And that's something called a log linear model. So this is kind of a very simple table of outcomes. We're just trying to measure one or two things. This is the situation in which this Poisson idea comes up. So we have our data that we're looking at is a table of counts. Number of times that various things happen when I was doing an experiment. And we're interested in, let's say it's a two-dimensional table, for example. Maybe it's 3 by 4. And we're interested in the expected cell counts. Uij. And we started out with some more complex table. Maybe it was I by J by K by L. And we decided to sum over some of these things. And so we were left with a two-dimensional table of counts when we had all of the things, the entries were all 0 or 1, but then we got rid of some of the dimensions because we didn't think they were important. And then the model for this is going to be something like log of the expected cell count equals a parameter lambda, a parameter for each, let's say in this case, a binary variable. So it's a 2x2 AI, A and B. So table is like I or A, B or J. And these, one thing about this is as kind of a Poisson, or it is a Poisson model. So you can think about these parameters as being like, okay, this is kind of this controls the grand total. So if I have a really simple model, which is just log mu ij equals lambda, then I'm assuming that whatever it is arriving at a constant rate, lambda, everywhere in the table, and there's no relationship between rows and columns. Then if I added on a little bit more, like the log of the expected cell count was this constant lambda plus a parameter for one variable and another parameter for the second variable, this would be like the rows and the columns are independent. I have a grand total, something that controls the grand total, something that controls the row sums, and something that controls the column sums. Now, of course, these things all interact. And one of the weird things that happens here is that there's a lot of choice of parameterization. So I gave these guys lower indices. So you can choose parameterizations for these models that give you kind of one parameter for every state. And then you'll have too many parameters, and you have to choose some kind of constraint that cuts down the space of parameters. So all these parameters have to do with log odds ratios, but they're related in a way that's like, it's like they occupy a linear space, and you're choosing different redundant coordinations of the linear space. And so that can make the interpretation of these models quite tricky, but it also gives you flexibility in terms of you get to choose which relationships you want to represent. So just to give a quick example of that. So for example, if I have a table like this, I have to choose a parameter for this relationship. I have to choose a parameter for the grand total. And then I could either choose a parameter here, a parameter here, a parameter here, a parameter here, which might make sense for for each increase in whatever this represents, I have a new parameter that represents the value of that increase. Maybe I could tie them all together, or I can make them all separate, up to me. I can also do something like I compare this first column with the second column, first column with this third column, first column with the fourth column, first column with the fifth column. So I can't do both of these because it would be too redundant, but I have to make some choice. And the choice of parameterization, or the choice of how to represent the model, should have to do with kind of what is the scientific hypothesis about, does it make more sense to compare each of these outcomes with a baseline, or does it make more sense to compare the outcomes against each other? So for example, the top would make more sense maybe if there was an ordinal relationship, and the bottom would make more sense if there was no ordinal, there was just a control and various conditions. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. As I mentioned in the introduction, I do have a YouTube course, which is this course. So this lecture I just gave is kind of an abbreviated version of a lecture about halfway through that course. So if anyone's interested in following up, I can give you that link.
Thanks
Thank you very much for your time.